Hello. Thank you so much for sharing this beautiful work with us. And for folks who might have joined us late, I'd love it if we could just give a brief introduction of who we all are and the role that we played. So, Jacqueline Lawton, facilitator of this extraordinary conversation, faculty member at UNC, and co director of Southern Futures. I'm going to pass it over to Marcella.
I'm Marcella Murray. I'm a collaborating co-creator on this project Primer and our previous work Distances.
Excellent. And
I'm
David.
David. I'm David Newman, and I'm also a collaborator on Primer and Distances.
And
Hi, I'm
Tay.
Tay Blow. Oh, hi. I'm Tay Blow, and I collaborated on both shows and did the digital work on Primer.
Excellent. So I have a series of questions for you, and we also have some audience questions for you. And the first one, I'm very curious because I know the work started off as in a theater in person, and the first show you worked on, and you had a chance to do it live, but you wanted to continue the conversation. COVID happened, and so it needed to shift to this digital space. And I'd love to hear from each of you. What was that like to put this How did you collaborate together? How did you create the piece? And what was it like? And I know, and so I hear, Tate, that you were involved in the first production. So I'm just so fascinated by this shift. Who would like to go first? Marcella, are you telling me you want to go?
Sure. I was going to say Tay would be a great person to talk about this shit, but I can start. Yeah, I mean, so much of this work is about being together. And so when COVID happened, it was, I don't know, like shifting to digital work, it has its own benefits and discoveries, but it's also, we were all like theater completely shut down for everyone, everywhere, our whole industry. And we were all sort of in mourning and missing the thing that we love to do. And that distances requires us being in a space like we felt that it needed to be protected. And so what does it look like to try to be together in the best way you can be using the digital media that we were using for the past year and a half, 2 years, I suppose, nearly. Um, yeah. Um, so, it was a natural, like, this is how we're all communicating with each other right now. This is how everything's being made right now. What does it mean to still try to make and still try to talk in the context of what we're already doing?
That's great. Hey, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, one of the first ideas that I think David and I were kind of discussing, like, oh, there's so many pieces of this initial piece, the stage piece, that needed more deep diving into. So wouldn't it be really cool if we made like remember when you would buy a DVD and then you'd buy the fancy version of the DVD and have all the special features on it? And like we were going to make a DVD special features only version of that show that had all these kind of side narratives and these other like director's commentaries and things like this. And then another like what eventually ended up happening in the middle of working on this project, you go there, was that the project at the very beginning of us doing rehearsals and sending like text back and forth. This is Toshi. Everyone started sending out, I'm going to ignore the event that preceded this, but everyone started sending out racial justice statements, racial equity statements. And all of a sudden, the world kind of turned into the like big staged version of the piece that we were already working on. And so things kind of shifted more into this like nimble thing where Marcel and Dave would just have a conversation and then we'd record it and then kind of work with some edited text about the Gemini missions or the first spacewalks, and then just kind of try to paste those objects together in order to still maintain the buoyancy of their dialogue, but not get too bogged down in this very dense, like strange, like mea culpa, we're going to do better language that really, as we can see now, like so much has changed and everyone is completely content with what's been shifted. Like that just became very clear that that wasn't interesting. It wasn't the way that things were actually going.
Yeah.
So that, like, the world kind of started informing the piece, despite our best attempts to like try to focus on like some specific thing. Like the world just acted in real time.
Yeah. David, do you want to share any thoughts about how it shifted for you?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this piece a lot, actually, and I think, you know, on a really basic level, what Marcella and I started all those years ago was an idea about proximity and what proximity can bring, proximity over time, and so the challenge of doing it digitally was pretty formidable at first. I definitely had a hard time figuring out how to. I like to work in a room with people. That's how I start to understand how to make theater. And so I found it very challenging at first. And so, but I think it's really like Tay's, you know, involvement and vision, being able to bring us into proximity, the ideas we had, you know, next to one another, in visually and through sound, etc. Helped me understand what we were making. I didn't want to just make fun of all the mea culpas, even though I received probably 80 in my email inbox that summer. I wanted to understand, like I felt for the struggle to, you know, to want to be part of this, want to be part of the solution, but also mired in like a very scared approach, right? A kind of a tentative footstep forward, and how to use language that way.
That's great. And when thinking about language, I watched this first on Tuesday, and so these are these lines are, they're still so much. It's such a moving, deeply moving, provocative piece, and so these are and I'm going to butcher them. But the very first one that stood out for me was, "It's unreasonable for me to be in this conversation." And that line takes me to this quote that I'm also going to butcher, which is about it's good that we should consider that Black folks are demanding justice, not revenge. It's some variation of that quote. This thing that we're asking for is equality, not revenge. And so I think about this. It's unreasonable for me to be in this conversation, and it what was before that was this conversation about safe. What is safe? What it isn't safe for me to be here. And I lead anti-racist trainings, and I always start the conversations with, I know that you asked for a safe space, but there's no such thing as a safe space as a Black woman in this country. What I can create for you is a brave space. And I walk the folks through that process. So that made me think about that. And then I also think about, are we supposed to imagine what walking through gravity should feel like? Or are we supposed to remember? And that is still, I still think about this. And I also love this quote about becoming aware of the space that you're in, meaning you were talking us through about, can you breathe, asking if we can breathe, and if not, then use where you are right now. Use the space. Don't fight it. Use it. And the question that is always being asked to you, Marcella, in the piece is, center your experience. And I think about, as a playwright, when people ask me what do I hope my plays do, I always say I'm decentering whiteness one play at a time by placing women of color at the center of my work. And it throughout the piece, you're tasked with center your experience. And so I'm curious, Marcelo, is that prompt is that prompt for you because you found yourself not centering your experience, or is that prompt meant for us to constantly to remind us as Black folks watching this to do it? I'm curious about how that works for you.
My hope is both. I share my experience and hope that it someone else is like, yeah, I feel that way too, and they can like be be okay in the way that I'm trying to be okay with not necessarily knowing what I'm supposed to do when we're in a space where you're trying to do the work to decenter whiteness, and
Yeah,
which can be new, be something that I've
right.
never experienced before in that specific way. And so
Yeah,
once you're there and it's like, yes, we're going to try to center Marcella's experience, then there's this feeling of, well, I've never been here before. What does that mean? What do I do? I feel like I have responsibilities, but I also feel like I have responsibilities to myself. Uh, I don't know. Let me just make lunch. Like, let me just sit and meditate
right.
on something that helps me get through the day. Like,
Yeah,
what is the thing that I'm supposed to do once my experience is centered? And
yeah,
also, um, how like what does that what does it any of it mean? It's this thing of like, I not just grappling with like decentering whiteness, but also centering myself. What does that mean? I it's a new challenge for me now that I'm in this new space of awareness. And so
yeah,
I hope that it asks people to um, remind themselves of that, as Black folks, to remind themselves that our experience should be centered in these sorts of conversations, um, and that also maybe it doesn't have to be such a heavy, like it will feel heavy, but maybe the thing that you do is just a thing to love having space, something that just
yeah.
makes the space nice.
I really love that, Marcella. And I think about how when we contemplate what is liberation, whether it's Black liberation, AAPI liberation, or just what is liberation. And I think about, well, it's cooking dinner and not having to think about, who I am when I walk into the room. It is meditating, not having to think about, am I the only in the room? Because I think about this moment that y'all talked about that shifted for you, which is, yes, we had all these accountability statements happening. We had the term BIPOC being reintroduced, right? This term that was actually introduced in 2013 but never caught on, and now it's here in this moment. And we quickly realized that BIPOC does one thing, which is identifies anti-Blackness, identifies Indigenous erasure, and then it conflates the experiences of people of color because it doesn't lift up our AAPI community, our North
Mhm.
African, Middle Eastern community, our Latinx community, our mixed race community. Right? There's so many people that are lumped together. And so I think at the same time that we had this, I love that we had this anti-Asian hate coming up, the conversation around how do we disrupt the xenophobia that's taking place in our society. All of this was wrestling at the same time. We have a question from the audience, which I'm really excited about. So at the beginning of this conversation, you talked about how you were at Sarah Lawrence, and Marcella, you were a student, and David was a professor. And and Tay, I don't know where you were in that trio. Were you also a
It
professor or
happened a little bit
student?
before my time.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Oh,
it
the
happened
initial
a little bit.
resistance has happened before your time. Okay, well, they were curious about
The
how did
the
the power
impetus, the
dynamic.
spark of this conversation did. Yeah.
Oh, okay, okay, okay. Thinking about that student-teacher relationship, which is a little bit different in graduate school, but still student-teacher relationship. Did that power dynamic impact the collaboration at all? And I'm curious that if it did, when Tay was brought on, was there still a power dynamic in the working relationship?
I think a lot of our work has been trying to question and interrogate that. Um, I mean, the
Yeah,
power dynamic was the why I approached David. I felt like he was a person in a position of power that I could ask what in the world was going on where we were. It was like I was a first year graduate student. There were conversations happening, and even though conversations about race take place everywhere, the context matters. Like what has happened in recent history matters, and I wasn't there for the recent history. I was a new student there. And so I understood the different issues that could be brought up, but I also didn't know just what the personal emotional grievances were. And so I was looking for that, and I was looking to hear like how like what can I do. Like in grad school you have a little bit more leeway, like you're thought of as like professionals, so it's more, it's closer. I felt like I felt like I had a responsibility as a grad student, a Black grad student on campus, to say something to a professor because I felt comfortable doing it.
Yeah.
The undergrad
And Dave,
students did, and I admired them, and they were so brave, but so young, and I felt like I had a responsibility to do something else with this extra space that I was granted.
yeah,
So the power dynamic is why the conversation happened. And um, part of our work is like trying to question that, trying to unpack these unbalances, trying to, because they just do exist. And how do you actually have a meaningful friendship and do actual work together
yeah,
across power dynamic differences?
that's great. David, what do you have any thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, I, I really felt like part of my responsibility as a professor is to ensure that students have a safe enough space so that they can explore their own creative voices. And so that's how I approached this conversation at first. But alongside the power dynamic of teacher and student was also a recognition of a fellow artist who was and is brilliant and has her own voice. And so I've found it easy to move into a collaboration, because I was interested in what that was bringing and having her voice in the room. So in that sense, I totally agree with what Marcella was saying, in that we are exploring that, or there's a level of inquiry and interrogation about these power dynamics that continue to this day and will continue. Yeah, I mean, she's a brilliant artist, and I'm lucky to be working with her.
That's really beautiful. And I know we're wrapping up our time. I'd love to hear from each of you because, again, you're creating this piece in the midst of a global pandemic that's shifting the way we all relate to one another, operate, and consider breathing with one another. I'm curious what maybe you've learned about yourself through this process, and whether it's the process of the global pandemic and how to survival in the midst of a global pandemic. How does it, or what is it to create art in the midst of a global pandemic? And Tay, I'd love to start with you. What is something you've learned about yourself through this process?
Um, I guess at the risk well, yeah, okay. I think one of the things that kind of came to the foreground, and this is maybe connected to the centering experience stuff, is that um, once we start to widen the lens of massive pan-institutional disciplines like theater or the visual arts or whatever to be more inclusive, um, something that had not occurred to me that I think is a developing component of the conversation is that with every within every conversation about race are a number of conversations about class that either get to be amplified or pushed aside, depending on how you want to swing the race conversation. And when you sort of stick them on either side of the the the, the discursive like balance beam, they work against one another in ways that you wouldn't expect, and they work with each other in ways that have this strange muting effect. It's almost like they satisfy the need for revolution by expressing the discontent, and that to me has really made me think about better ways of using my skills or my energies, because the things that we're dealing with are so powerful that they have the power to defeat themselves, defeat their own political potential for change once they're expressed in art. I don't know if that makes any sense, but that's what I've been thinking about.
It does. No, it does. It makes great sense. David, what about you?
I've been thinking about time, the use of time. Like, I think that's one of the things that Marcella and I discovered in our conversation. Like, intuitively, we thought, oh, if we actually spend time, if we actually have this conversation over a period of time, that's how change can actually happen. And even one-on-one, there's potential for powerful shifts internally and externally, if you give time, right? Trust is built, et cetera, et cetera. So I've been thinking about that in terms of larger issues as well. Like, I don't get as fussy as I used to when I'm driving and there's somebody slow in front of me, for instance, right? There's like this sense of like, you know what? I don't know what that person is suffering. I don't know if I need to be there 42 seconds earlier, if that's really going to help. And so, like slowing down a little bit, at least internally, has been a really big part of where I've come to since COVID.
That's amazing. That's really, really beautiful. Because what you're talking about so powerfully is perspective and compassion. And I think if that's anything we can move forward from this moment, that's really, really powerful. Marcella, what are your thoughts?
I think I've thought of time and what, similar to Tay, what stokes our desire to change things and what tamps it out before we even get started. I've also thought about, a lot of the things that I made in this piece have a lot to do with like meditation and trying to sit with, trying to mull over, being okay with, or learning how to be, to just be with. And so this whole conversation about race, so much of it is, I think one of the things that David and I learned early on is that one of the pressures that stops this conversation from getting anywhere before it gets off is the pressure to get somewhere, the pressure to answer, to solve. And so much about race has been baked and built over centuries. And the idea that we'll solve racism or any of that, we knew that it would like we had to relinquish the pressure of that. And so we ask questions and we sit with the question, and over time we change in how we're viewing the question, how we're grappling with the question. And it isn't so much getting answers, it's changing, growing along with your understanding of why the question is difficult to answer. So, this year's been, the past year has been rough. How do I think of myself in this moment? I don't understand it. How do I think of myself? What did it mean to be Black before I understood that it was attached to trauma in the world, and is it something that I remember or is it something that I'm creating? and I don't have answers, but I have sitting with and trying to grow with. And I don't know, I think that's what a conversation is actually, if you commit to it over time. You aren't asking a question and then answering it, you are listening to each other and sitting with. And so I think that's what I've been meditating over and, learning and exploring throughout this piece and this past year. It's like how to sit with and how to grow alongside and view something differently.
I think that's really beautiful. And I think that what you're giving us in this product is your process. And I think about how when you're in relationship, you're not in a relationship to an endpoint of something. You're in relationship as you're deepening your awareness of each other, your understanding of yourself. And I feel like conversation does that same thing. So the impossible conversation that you're having, it's not that it's impossible to have, it's that there is no end. It's this endless rich conversation that's teaching anew everyone who engages in it, which I think is a really, really beautiful experience. And I cannot thank you enough for sharing your journey with all of us, and for being here and being in residence with us. And I feel like our faculty, our students and staff, everyone who gets to interact with you is going to really be transformed in some way. And it's really generous of you to share your time, your talent, your brilliance, your questions with all of us. And I just want to thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. We're excited to be with you.
Yeah, looking forward.
Excellent. Thank you everyone for watching. Thank you everyone for coming this evening, spending your Friday with us. We'll have more events. So keep an eye out on our website to learn more.